Hello, Journey, and welcome to our very second Zoom Sabbath School lesson that's accompanying our very third at this point live stream. And so we are looking forward to sharing a conversation with you today. We have been following the Sabbath School quarterly. And last week we talked about worship and education. And today we are going to be using as a springboard, and I'm going to say that very intentionally as a springboard, education and redemption. And so just to give a brief overview of the lesson for this week, we look at the life of Jesus, and we look at the works of Moses and the prophets, and we look at the writings of Paul. And one of the things that we see alongside the story of redemption is the story of education. That education, learning, that transmitting ideas is an incredibly important part of our salvation history. Jesus taught, and in fact, Jesus' title, rabbi, literally means teacher. And so, to a degree, Jesus, through most of his ministry, was a teacher. Now, whether he was teaching the disciples in a close in group, or whether he was teaching the crowds or the multitudes, sometimes he was even schooling the religious elite. Whatever the case may be, Jesus was an educator. And I think that we carry on this tradition, and I'm very proud of our Adventist tradition where we carry on this emphasis on education because we believe that education is incredibly important.
Um, yeah, just hearing you kind of describe that, um, Jesus being an educator, I think about the way that Jesus taught. Um, and so I'll say 2 points to that is Jesus used story to teach, parables, like that's what he used. Yeah, he might have broken down to his disciples a little bit more, but when he was teaching to the larger crowd, he usually spoke in parables. And even now us, right, in the 21st century, looking back at Jesus as scripture, we don't read it the same way we read a textbook, because it's one giant narrative, one giant story. And so that almost makes me like think about um like how do we educate in our churches or in our schools, uh if that makes sense. Like, Um, again, I bring back that book that I brought up last week because that author touches on some of those things, desiring the kingdom. And one of the things that he says is that this author, James K. Smith, is we don't we don't embody story, narrative, and experience the way the secular world does it.
Mm,
So we get captivated by the secular world because we're like story creatures, we're like creatures who experience, who feel, who touch. And so just and he says that the part where most churches fail is that they aim for the head but they don't aim for the heart.
mm.
So they try to educate with doctrines and things like this, but we don't go to the heart of the human experience, the touch, the feel, the taste, the community, the warmth, the desires. Like, we don't do that because we look at the secular world and we're like, well, they're doing that, so that must be bad.
Hmm.
And so I don't know, like, do we need to have a shift in the way we educate? I don't know.
No, that's a really good question. And to kind of talk to that, it's interesting that Adventists especially are really big at speaking to the head, and many of us grew up with the thing like it's not enough to feel that you're saved, you have to know that you're saved because our emotions and our feelings can deceive us and distract us, et cetera, et cetera. And so, Adventism for a very long time has been very cerebral. And in fact, cerebral to the point that we're almost scared of the manifestation of the Holy Spirit because especially if it's anything on the emotional level, our emotional response, like we're really reserved when it comes to that sort of thing. So what's interesting is that we aim for the head, but I don't actually think we aim for the head correctly. Albert Einstein was once asked what the speed of sound was. And he responds with, well, I don't know off the top of my head because I've chosen not to file that, like to keep that here. He's like, people misunderstand what education is. A lot of people think education is just cramming facts into your head. For me, education was about learning how to think. And so I'm wondering if part of the problem is that we as Adventism, when we think of religious education, it is we're cramming those facts into the head, right? And we're cramming in doctrine, like you were saying, doctrine. And this is why you believe what you believe. Here are the proof texts that prove what you believe. And we're going to just keep stuffing it in there. But perhaps instead of that, we should actually be teaching, like they tried to do before the rise of fundamentalism, critical thinking, especially with our religious faith, especially with our scriptures and whatnot, is not the ability to proof text, but the ability to interact with the scriptures and to meaningfully, and to maybe even disagree with the scriptures.
Yeah.
No.
So kind of what I'm hearing you say is, this cliche, knowledge is power, right? We've all heard that. And one of the things that my brother likes to say, he says, no, knowledge isn't power. It's the application of knowledge that is power. And so that's kind of the same thing here. It's education is power, doctrine is power, right? But it's actually the application, the living out of that doctrine. Like, we don't have the 28 beliefs for no reason. Like, there's a reason to it. And you can argue they're important and not important, but they're there for a reason. And I feel like if you apply them, if you live those out, then you're better off, and at least in Adventism, like living them off. And so I guess just like it's not so much about, like what you're saying, we're aiming for the head wrong, and we're not producing anything. We're not executing anything. We're not living out that story that we're trying to educate people about. And it goes back to last week's conversation, because if we're trying to live out that story, then it goes back to the whole worship and education. Are we worshiping the way we should in education? Are we making sure that resources are given out properly? Are we there for the communities that are hurting? Like, that's applying the story and living out the story versus just knowing the facts, like versus just knowing that, yeah, Jesus died on the cross, but what is the living out of the cross? Like, what does that look like? Yeah,
Perhaps the why, yeah. Perhaps instead of the how or the what, but the why. Why is it important? Why does it matter in our lives?
Yeah, that's good. And I think that once we get down to the heart of the why, then different church communities have different how they approach the why. So what might work for Journey might not work for a church in here in Northern California. But the why is the same, but the how is different. And I'll give you a better example of that. So yeah, I'll give you a better example of that. I was talking to one of my friends, Andy Palomares. Shout out to him, pastor at Crosswalk, youth pastor. And I was asking him, because he runs a collegiate ministry, and I was asking him, he just graduated. And I was like, yo, dude, do you kind of feel left out already? Like, out of the loop because you graduated and you really don't know, like, what's going on anymore? Because, like, you really haven't been a student during this pandemic. So the people that you're trying to minister to are going through a different experience that you went through in college. And I'm like, you ever think about that? Like, I know you just graduated, but like, you get that, like, oh, I'm out of the loop type of thing. And one of the things that he said, like, yeah, sure, like I do and whatever. Um, but here's what I told him afterwards. Because he says he's not necessarily like feeding into the student aspect of his ministry. Like he's not necessarily like tackling like student issues and like whatever comes with being a student in the pandemic. But what's interesting is that I also do collegiate ministry, and I'm heavily focused on the La Sierra community. And what's interesting is that we're essentially sharing the same community. And while he might tackle issues that are a little bit more um, different, I'm tackling issues within my community about directly to school to students. And so the why is the same, right? The why is Jesus and his story, but the how is a little bit different. He might be doing something else, but it doesn't matter because we're reaching the same community, and so we're both feeding the same community. And so they can go to Crosswalk and do that, but then they can come here and find us on social media and they can get the student experience. Um, I don't know if that makes sense though. Like, does that make sense?
Well, is it perhaps what you're saying is that belief and life is not one dimensional? Just one approach isn't necessarily A, what works for everyone,
Yeah.
and B, what works for us all the time, or C, what works, works for us alone. Like what I'm seeing with you and Andy is that you're both doing ministry and you're both reaching Jesus, people for Jesus, and telling people about Jesus. But the angles you're taking, perhaps with some students, they want both. Perhaps it's not an either or thing. Perhaps they do need both, and maybe different people in different seasons. Maybe there are people in certain seasons that need that part of it, and maybe there are some people that in certain seasons need this part of it. That's why I've always been a big proponent of members and whatnot. Checking out other services, hearing other sermons, going other places, because especially in different seasons, I don't know if necessarily it's healthy for you to be part of one church community your entire life
Mm.
and have one pastor your entire life. I actually think it's important to have more than that. Why?
Yeah.
Because different pastors and different churches bring different perspectives and different ways of doing things. Some resonate with you more, some less. Some in different seasons resonate more or less. Um, and you're right. Jesus is ultimately at the center of it all. How we get there, however, might look different, you know.
So so here's where I get the possible danger, if you consider this a danger. Because what we're saying essentially is we're now opening the door to, as long as Jesus is in the center, you don't have to be Adventist. You don't have to educate in the Adventist manner. Like uh, the church across the street, the Baptist church or or the Catholic church or the Lutheran church, they have the why too. But the how might be different. So I feel like that's maybe like, if you want to consider that a potential danger. I personally don't. Like, I don't personally like, yeah, bro, like you're, not Adventist, you're in the wrong. But I don't know if we can have that conversation. Like, is that I don't know, is that a potential danger, or is that just like different, how different, why, where does education lie in that? Like, I'm lost, to be honest.
But a danger to what is what I would ask.
To the to what we've been taught, like at least I've been taught, like, you know.
Well, let me ask you a question. What are we baptized into?
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah, yeah, in the name of Jesus.
We're baptized into Christ. We are not baptized into Adventism.
Yeah,
We are God ministers of the gospel. And right now our hats are here in the Seventh-day Adventist church.
but would, like, I you know where I you know I, I'm all I'm a, I agree with you 100%. But I feel like what this Sabbath school lesson is talking about, education, it's strictly, not strictly, but in a way, we've put up these institutions for since our kids are super small until they graduate, because we want them to be Adventists. And then education, what do? We go across the world and we help people who need it, but not without giving them the education of being Adventists. Uh, and I was just talking to another pastor about this the other day. We preach the health message, but it's the way we preach it isn't trending, you know? The way
It could trend.
yeah, it could trend because right now uh being vegan and being vegetarian is actually trending. Like that's cool to be, but it's not cool to be Adventist, you know what I mean? But like the health message is like one of our focal points, yet we have taught it the wrong way. And that's why we like our businesses could be booming right now. You know what I mean? Like we could be owning food labs, we could be owning like strips of food, like mall strips of food, and all be vegetarian and vegan. But we're so inclined to that education that we basically want to like almost drown people in Jesus, like right? Like so I don't know.
Is it in Jesus though, or is it in Adventism? That is ultimately the question. Is it in Jesus or is it in three angels' message? Is it
Yeah,
in Jesus or is it in Sabbath observance? Is it in Jesus or is it in an incorrect versus correct modes of worship? I mean, that's the question we have to ask ourselves. Look, my way of thinking about it is we educate people in the ways of Christ. Now, I believe that Adventism and Adventist, more specifically Adventist theology, has something to contribute there that is meaningful and worthwhile and beautiful.
yeah,
Our understanding of cosmology and our understanding of afterlife, our understanding of death and hell, and even Sabbath and all these things, when in the service, put in the service of the gospel where it's supposed to be, is an incredibly beautiful view of the gospel.
yeah,
But Jesus must always come first, right? And like you were saying, and context, we have to be contextual. I mean, remember what Paul says. When I was with the Jews, I was like a Jew. When I was with the Romans, I was like a Roman. Like, short of sin, we should be doing everything we can to make it all contextual. Here is the problem, though, is that fundamentalism at its core is against contextualization.
yeah,
And we have gone hook, line, and sinker into fundamentalism. Um, and that's part of the problem is when the part of the problem when you've stuffed in so many facts and you haven't given room for actual thinking, it makes it a lot harder to contemporize or contextualize your message, right? And that's the thing is that we have to almost unclutter what we got going on. I was actually talking about this week when I was talking about Sabbath. I was spent so much of my life was spent telling me how to Sabbath and how not to Sabbath that honestly I hated Sabbath.
mm,
I would look at the bulletin, I would see what time Sabbath was over, and I would at home I would wait for that time so I could have fun again. Because I'm like, I'm not allowed to do anything. Nobody told me why. And once I found out the why of Sabbath, and especially like now at this point in my life when I see what Sabbath could really be, or in college when I saw what Sabbath could be, about dropping everything and letting it be and getting rid like dropping all of the expectations that the world and society and everyone else had for me and just looking at what God wanted me to be. That's when I found the beauty of it,
yeah,
right? But that's the problem is I think that what we have to do is we have to start shifting in instead of just dealing with facts and putting facts into people's heads, which aren't bad, we have to teach people how to think. Look at the last 4 years, to be honest with you. A lot of the reason why a lot of the stuff happened in the last 4 years and why a lot of the rubbish happened in the last 4 years is because people aren't willing to think.
mm-hmm.
They're not willing to critically think and they're not willing to question things. That's the problem. And see that, but part of the problem is in Adventism, we don't like people questioning things either. We claim we do, but we really don't. A lot of pastors really don't like it when you ask questions.
Yeah,
Or they say they do, but then like they shut you down or they'll like just throw a bunch of facts at you. I think one of the most powerful things that we can say is, I don't know, but like we could find out together. And so I think that's what education should focus on, man. I think that like our education should honestly focus on creating thinkers. It's hard though when you're trying to indoctrinate the people that you're trying to have critically think. And honestly, that's the biggest complaint I have a lot of young adults tell me now. Is they're like, our entire lives we were taught that we should question, and we were taught that we should question things. Now, usually was question those other churches, question your science classes, question this and that and the other. But then like they're like, you taught us how to question, but then when we turn the questions inward, now you get uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And my whole thing has always been, look, God is the source of truth. And if the truth is the truth, and if God is God, then God can stand up to the questioning. And the truth can stand firm to the questioning. The truth can withstand doubt, and the truth can withstand reason and questioning and critical thinking. And honestly, if God didn't want us critically thinking, why would we be created with the capacity to critically think?
Yeah.
And so, like, I guess that's my big thing, man, is like with education and redemption. I'm fully on board with this, 100%. But look at what Jesus did. Jesus did not cram a bunch of facts down people's throats. Jesus didn't cram a bunch of facts down the disciples' throats, to be honest with you. Most of what Jesus did, and Jesus understood that teaching in parable was a risky thing because people just might not get it. But he's like, it's crazy though, like when those stories, like people do get it. But that's because if you think about it, if you're willing to think about it, if you're willing to say, okay, well, is he literally meaning this, or what might be going on behind this?
Yeah.
Like when Jesus is talking about the sower, right? It's not a literal sower he's talking about. He's just using it as a symbol for a greater reality. And we can't just take that at face value.
Um, Man, yeah, going back to the whole Jesus being a teacher, um, it reminds me of a study we had over the summer when we were talking about I think we were talking about the Sermon on the Mount, possibly, or we were how Jesus meets our needs first, like how Jesus feeds us first, um, and then he continues to teach,
Hmm.
whether that be through physical food or through physical healing or just through just presence where he shouldn't be present, or someone he shouldn't be talking to, someone he shouldn't be seated with, but the fact that he's there. And so it goes back to full circle. Like if we're going to educate properly, then we need to meet the needs of our communities properly.
Yeah.
Because the facts are important, yes, but what what's the point of the facts, you know, um, if you have families in your congregation that haven't ate for like 2-3 days, who maybe don't have running hot water, who or um, if you want to switch it to from poor to someone wealthy, who are misusing their money, like putting their money in places that as a it just doesn't align with the story of Jesus. And maybe encouraging them and urging them to facilitate. Sorry about that, my headphones got connected. But yeah, just making that switch of meeting people's needs, being present, um, because like I'm sure we all like know of or heard of like those churches or whatever, or not even churches. I'll say like for school. Um, you have admin people or professors who have certain requirements, but they don't even take the time to see how you're doing as a student.
Hmm.
And it's like I have a professor who constantly, at least he sends an email once a week reminding us of whatever is happening for school. But at the end, he's also let me know how you're doing. Like, are you okay? And I read that, I'm like, that's cool. Like, that's dope. Because like it lets me know that like he's there for my personal needs too. And so maybe if we educate in that way, where we meet the needs of people, and that's it, you know, that's it. Because the needs is the story itself. The meeting the needs is the story. Because a lot of people would try to meet the needs of people, and then they'll be like, "Oh yeah, but like, let me tell you these 28 beliefs." Then you're not really meeting the needs of people. You're just trying to baptize people for no reason. You know what I mean? But I don't know. That's just kind of where my train of thought is going.
Well, I like it because I think the truth has to be contextual. I think the truth has to be practical. I think the truth has to actually help people's lives and improve people's lives. Otherwise, it's sort of irrelevant. Yeah. I mean, I've told people before, like, I could tell you all sorts of theories on all sorts of things. But when we're down in the trenches or in the pews and we're there with the members who are dealing with very real things and very real hurt, sometimes those abstract theories don't mean as much.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they're there. It doesn't mean they're not important, but it just means that sometimes we have to look at how are we packaging things, how are we approaching things, how are we teaching things. And you're right, like showing that you care and honestly touching the heart is just as important and if not more important than reaching the mind. Um, I could give people facts all day long about why they shouldn't be racist and how all of their racist ideologies or homophobic ideologies are wrong. Okay. And I'd be correct. But quite honestly, that might win an argument, but that doesn't change minds. It's when we connect to the heart, it's when we actually connect with lived experience and when we have them see the lived experience of somebody else, when we show them why they should care, that's where the change really happens. And that takes time, unfortunately. And sometimes we don't have that luxury, but we try. Yeah. But I think that should be the scope of education, to tell people why they should care about things, to get people invested and caring about things, to get people caring about other people. And I think it's, yeah, you're right. What we talked about from the beginning is that balance of the heart and the head. Because I think that we've been divorcing the two things for too long. And I think that we've been doing a great disservice to ourselves. I mean, EQ and IQ are both important because I think that from our emotional intelligence comes the idea of the compassion and empathy. And Jesus had all that. Jesus had an incredibly high IQ and EQ.
Yeah.
Because Jesus knew that it wasn't just about winning arguments, it was about winning hearts.
Mm.
And when we show people we care and we show people we love them, and we teach them to go and do likewise, honestly, then I think we're doing okay. They might not Sabbath perfectly. They might eat pork or something once in a while. They might not do everything that we'd want them to do.
Okay.
But if they're following Jesus, we kind of have to like roll with it, and let Jesus do Jesus's thing. And perhaps that's part of the problem is that we often try to do too much, or
Yeah.
or to do more than we actually need to. Because we have to acknowledge that Jesus does some of the work in their hearts without us. I
Mm.
don't think it's our place to be putting a whole bunch of just information in there. I think first and foremost, we should be teaching people how to think and then giving them, and then once we give them the information, then they can take it and use it instead of just letting it sit there and
Yeah.
dust.
No, yeah. That's good. Mm. I don't know. I feel like we yeah, and I think because just hearing you, I think a part of it is understanding how people learn at the same time. Like I know you said teaching people how to think, but also understanding how people learn.
Mm.
Because I think the reason we're on the same wavelength is because we're both social and we're both emotional. But for somebody who is naturally a critical thinker and who it really isn't that social and emotional, like in tune with their emotion, they actually might appreciate the doctrine and the facts more than they do the presence and so
Possible.
and so yeah, so I think what it is knowing your members, knowing your community, knowing how people learn, um, you know, and so it's just really getting to invest in your community. And when you do that, you can then partner people like you and I, and then we can grow together. And then you can partner people who aren't emotional or social, and they can grow together. And then we can partner each other, because then it lets us know the differences, the strengths, the weaknesses. We might be like, doctrine, what's the point of that? And they'll be like, no, 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 doctrine is actually really dope because of A, B, C, D. And then we'll be like, hey, bro, community is actually really important too. Like, maybe you should stay for a potluck one day. You know what I mean? And so I think that's the way that we can foster thinking, and we can foster learning and growing at the same time too.
And at the end of the day, that's essentially the story of redemption and the story of communal redemption, where we're learning and growing and loving together. And we're learning more about Jesus together. So yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, man. Like, depending on, because I don't think you can have it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
You have to take it on a case by case, person by person basis and see who the person is, how they interact with the world around them. And then we have to go from there. But again, that's why I think why the thinking is so important, is that what it does is, especially for those of us who are educating, it's important that we know that not everyone does it the same way. And so we have to change our approaches. So like as pastors, we have to change our approach constantly depending on who we're talking to.
Yeah.
Like I'll go from meeting from member to member to member, and I will change my tack 180 degrees sometimes, depending on who I'm talking to, because I know what works for some and doesn't work for others. And I'm wondering if education isn't too much different than that. But I think we did a pretty good job. Is there something else you wanted to add on there?
Yeah, sorry. I would say education doesn't always do a good job in that way. And I say that because of standardized testing.
Mm-hmm.
We give all these kids these, like, hey, this is the curriculum that you have to follow. And if you don't get this score, then I'm sorry, you can't. And so that's where I would say, again, know your community, know your students. Who is a visual learner? Who is a hands-on learner? Who is I can read the textbook and you can teach me and I'll learn. Like what kind of learner are your students?
Mm-hmm.
Does standardized testing work for you? Does it not work for you? And so, because if we're being honest, standardized testing has kept a lot of students out of college, out of better opportunity.
Well,
Because
also the system is working as designed, and that's part of the problem.
yeah, and like with standardized testing comes again the whole: are you meeting the student's needs? How do you expect the student to come in and get a 1400 on a test, but he hasn't had breakfast for the past week, and his sleep schedule is way off because his parents don't get home from work till like late night? So it's like, meet the needs, learn about the student, and yeah, like see how they learn, how they think, and help them grow from there.
And if the government's not willing to help with those things, which honestly I think it should, then the church should. And actually, that's a good segue, because this is a good segue to our next conversation next week. Because next week we're actually talking about the church in education, and what roles do the church play in all of this. And so I think that the stuff that we're talking about here, and we kind of talked about last week, is a perfect example of how the church can actually help education. So for those of you at home, those of you watching and checking with us, thank you for hanging with us today as we talk some about the Sabbath School lesson. Be with us next week as we talk about the church and education. And quite honestly, we're probably going to go off on a tangent again, which is totally okay. But we want to talk about how the church can actually help in the process of education, and how the church educates, and how the church, maybe the church can more responsibly educate in not just general things, but also in our beliefs. So thank you all for joining us. Remember, God loves you very much. Remember to love each other. And remember that we at Journey SDA love you, and no distance can change that. So we'll see you guys next week, all right?